Did you know over 40% of Arizona's small towns report unexplained phenomena annually? Welcome to Unheard Fears, where we uncover the terror hiding in America's forgotten places. Tonight, 9 true horror stories from Arizona's isolated communities will leave you questioning what's real. Names and identifying details have been altered to protect privacy, but these encounters happen to real people. Comment below with your location and what time you're watching this. Are you brave enough to watch alone at night? Like and subscribe for more true horror stories that the world forgot. I never believed in curses or supernatural warnings until September 2018, when I took what seemed like the easiest job of my career. My name is Santino, and I've worked as a municipal records clerk for Clifton, Arizona for nearly 12 years. Clifton is a small copper mining town tucked into the mountains of Greenlee County, population barely scraping 3,000 souls. Most of my work involves filing permits, updating property records, and digitizing old documents that have been collecting dust in various storage facilities around town. When my supervisor assigned me to spend a few weeks in the abandoned Phelps Dodge Records building on Chase Creek Street, I thought it would be tedious but straightforward work. I had no idea I was about to encounter something that would shatter my understanding of reality itself. The Phelps Dodge Records building was a 3-story brick structure that hadn't been occupied in over a decade. It sat at the edge of town, surrounded by empty lots where other mining company buildings once stood. The place smelled like ancient paper, leather, and copper dust from nearly a century of housing mining operation files. My job was simple enough. I needed to scan and digitize payroll records, death certificates, inventory logs, and other documents dating from the 1880s through the 1920s. The town was selling the building the following year, and everything had to be archived before demolition. I set up my equipment in a second-floor room with decent natural light and started working through the boxes systematically, one dusty file at a time. The first few days were mind-numbingly routine. I scanned hundreds of pages documenting the daily operations of copper mining in territorial Arizona. There were handwritten payroll ledgers listing workers' names and wages, accident reports describing cave-ins and equipment failures, death certificates for men who died underground, inventory manifests tracking tons of copper ore. The documents painted a picture of brutal, dangerous work performed by immigrants from dozens of countries. I found records in English, Spanish, and even Chinese from workers who'd come to Arizona chasing mining wealth. It was fascinating from a historical perspective, but exhausting to process page after page of faded ink and cramped handwriting. Everything changed on my 4th day when I noticed something impossible. I was scanning an 1887 payroll ledger when a number sequence caught my attention. It was a 47-digit number written in the margin of the page, seemingly unrelated to any payroll information. The digits were clear and deliberate, written in the same ink as the rest of the document. I assumed it was some kind of accounting reference or coded filing system, though 47 digits seemed excessive for any practical purpose. I made a note of it and continued working. An hour later, I found the same 47-digit sequence in a completely different document, an 1893 death certificate for a Chinese miner. The sequence was written in the corner of the certificate, again in period-appropriate ink. Same exact 47 digits in the same exact order. Over the next 2 days, I found that sequence 17 more times. It appeared in timber supply manifests from 1901, medical logs from 1889, correspondence between mine supervisors from 1912, even a shipping receipt from 1920. The documents came from different decades, different departments, different languages, and different handwriting styles. Yet the 47-digit number was identical every single time. I started photographing each occurrence with my phone, documenting the impossibility of it. How could the same complex numerical sequence appear across documents spanning 40 years, written by dozens of different people, in contexts that had nothing to do with each other? There was no logical explanation, no accounting system, no filing code, no mathematical reference would require a 47-digit number repeated across unrelated records. I called my supervisor on the 6th day and asked if there were any records explaining numerical codes used by the mining company. He told me he'd never heard of such a thing and suggested I just focus on scanning the documents rather than analyzing their content. I tried to follow his advice, but I couldn't stop noticing the number. It was everywhere. I found it in personnel files, equipment maintenance logs, even in meeting minutes discussing labor disputes. Each time I discovered it, the fluorescent lights in the building seemed to flicker, and the temperature would drop noticeably. I started wearing a jacket while working, even though it was September in Arizona and hot outside. Inside that building, especially when I found another instance of the sequence, the air turned cold enough to see my breath. By the second week, something even more disturbing emerged. I began comparing the dates of the documents chronologically, and I realized the 47-digit number was changing. Not randomly, but systematically. It was counting down. Documents from the 1880s showed the highest values. Documents from the 1920s showed lower values. The sequence was decreasing over time, like some kind of countdown embedded across 40 years of mining records. I pulled out my calculator and started working through the mathematics, trying to determine the rate of decrease and project when it might reach zero. Based on the pattern I documented, I estimated the countdown would complete approximately 830 days from my present date in 2018. That terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. Something was counting down to an event, and that event was approaching. The really disturbing part started when the number began appearing outside the historical documents. I was updating my phone's notes one evening after work when I noticed fragments of the sequence in my own digital timestamps. I checked my electric bill when I got home and found portions of the sequence embedded in my account number. Something I'd never noticed before. License plates on cars outside the records building seemed to contain segments of the digits. I started seeing the pattern everywhere, as if recognizing it in the old documents had opened my perception to its presence in the modern world. I couldn't determine if it had always been there and I'd simply become aware of it, or if something about discovering it in the building had infected my ability to perceive numbers correctly. I stopped sleeping well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the 47 digits scrolling through my mind. I found myself writing the sequence unconsciously on scratch paper, on napkins, in the margins of my own notebooks. My handwriting would form the numbers without my conscious decision to write them. During the day at the records building, I experienced moments of complete, oppressive silence. Clifton is a small town, but there's always ambient noise. Traffic on the highway, birds, wind through the empty buildings. When I worked in that second-floor room, particularly when I found another instance of the countdown sequence, all sound would cease. Total, absolute silence would descend, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat. And my heartbeat would develop a rhythm, a pattern of 4 beats followed by 7 beats, over and over. 4-7, 4-7, 4-7. The smell in the building changed too. Initially, it was just old paper and copper dust, unpleasant but expected. As I continued finding the sequence, a new smell emerged. It was sharp and electric, like the air before a lightning storm. That ozone smell would intensify whenever I discovered the numbers, filling my nose and mouth with a taste like licking batteries. The papers themselves felt wrong in my hands. They were too cold, too smooth, as if the physical documents were rejecting my touch. I started experiencing vibrations through the floor, a low-frequency rumble like standing near massive industrial machinery, though the building was silent and empty except for me. On my 12th day in the building, I found a ledger I hadn't seen before. It was tucked behind other boxes, wrapped in canvas, and labeled only with a date from 1906. Inside were pages of nothing but the 47-digit sequence, repeated hundreds of times in different hands. Some entries were in English, some in Spanish, some in Chinese characters. Beneath each number sequence were notes. Observed in ore samples. Manifested in equipment serial numbers. Workers reporting the pattern in dreams. The ledger documented other people, over a century ago, discovering the same thing I had discovered. They had noticed the countdown, and their notes grew increasingly desperate and paranoid. The final entry, dated December 1906, read simply, "It knows we see it. Ceasing observations. God have mercy." I left the building that afternoon and never returned. I called my supervisor and quit without explanation, forfeiting 2 weeks of work I'd already completed. I couldn't articulate what I'd experienced without sounding insane. How do you explain that you've discovered an impossible numerical countdown embedded in century-old documents, that the countdown has infected your perception of reality, that you can't stop seeing the pattern everywhere you look? My supervisor was frustrated but ultimately accepted my resignation. The town contracted with someone else to finish the digitization work. I heard later that the records building was demolished in 2020, 2 years ahead of schedule. Here's what haunts me most. I can't remember the complete 47-digit sequence anymore. I took photographs. I wrote it down dozens of times, but when I try to recall it now, my mind goes blank. I remember fragments, pieces, but never the complete number. It's as if whatever I discovered in that building has partially erased itself from my memory, while leaving behind the certainty that it existed. I still see portions of the sequence occasionally, in phone numbers, in serial codes, in random arrangements of digits. Each time I recognize a fragment, I feel that same temperature drop, that same electric taste in my mouth, that same bone-deep vibration, and I feel certain, absolutely certain, that something was counting down. Something vast and incomprehensible was using those mining records to mark time toward an event I cannot name or understand. I left Clifton entirely 6 months after leaving that job. I moved to Phoenix and found work in a completely different field, deliberately avoiding anything involving historical records or numerical data. But I can't escape the questions that consume me. Did I discover something real, some cosmic countdown embedded in reality itself? Or did something in that building break my perception, infecting me with a pattern that never existed except in my deteriorating mind? Were those 19th century miners documenting the same phenomenon, or was I hallucinating significance into random numbers? I'll never know. What I do know is this. Somewhere, something is counting down. I calculated it would reach zero approximately 830 days from September 2018. By my estimation, that date has already passed, and I have no idea what happened when it reached zero, or if anything happened at all. Maybe the world ended, and we're living in whatever comes after. Maybe nothing happened, and I wasted months of my life obsessing over coincidence and pattern recognition gone wrong. Or maybe the countdown reached zero and something changed in ways too subtle or too vast for any of us to recognize. I see fragments of those 47 digits almost every day, and every time I see them, I wonder if I'm the only one who remembers that something was counting down, or if somewhere, someone else is seeing the same patterns and asking the same questions I can never answer. My name is Rebecca, and I've been a long-haul truck driver for 6 years. I've driven every major highway in the western United States, from the California coast to the Texas Panhandle, logging hundreds of thousands of miles behind the wheel of my 18-wheeler. I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Blizzards in Wyoming, dust storms in Nevada, dense fog through Oregon mountain passes. I'd dealt with aggressive drivers, mechanical breakdowns, and the crushing loneliness that comes with spending weeks alone on the interstate. But nothing in those 6 years prepared me for what happened on U.S. Route 191 in February 2021, when I made the worst decision of my career and picked up a hitchhiker who turned out to be hunting far more than just a ride. Route 191 between Clifton and Morenci, Arizona is one of those highways that locals know to respect. It's a winding two-lane road that climbs through the mountains, full of hairpin turns and steep drop-offs with nothing but thin guardrails between the asphalt and 100-foot plunges into rocky canyons below. During winter months, the road gets even more treacherous with ice patches and limited visibility. Most truck drivers avoid it when possible, but I was hauling copper from a Morenci mine to a processing facility in New Mexico, and Route 191 was the most direct path. I'd driven it dozens of times before without incident. That February night, I was making good time despite the cold, listening to true crime podcasts through my headphones, focused on the endless curves illuminated by my headlights cutting through the darkness. It was about 1:30 in the morning when I saw him, a figure standing on the shoulder near mile marker 147, arm extended with his thumb out in the universal hitchhiker gesture. He was wearing a worn denim jacket that looked inadequate for the near-freezing temperature, and he seemed middle-aged, average height. Nothing particularly threatening about his appearance. I should have driven past. Company policy explicitly forbids picking up hitchhikers, and every safety training video I'd ever watched warned against it. But something about the isolation of that mountain highway, the brutal cold, and my own loneliness after 2 weeks on the road made me feel sympathetic. I imagined myself stranded in that cold and made a split-second decision I'll regret for the rest of my life. I hit the air brakes and brought the rig to a stop about 50 yards past him. He jogged up to the passenger door and climbed into the cab with a grateful smile, thanking me repeatedly for stopping. His voice was pleasant, his demeanor polite. He said his name didn't matter, that he was just trying to get to Safford, about 90 miles north. I told him I could take him as far as Morenci, which was only about 20 miles up the road. He settled into the passenger seat and I pulled back onto the highway, thinking I'd done a good deed on a cold night. We made small talk for the first few miles. I asked where he was from, and he gave vague answers about passing through. He asked about my route, and I explained the copper haul. Everything seemed normal, just two strangers sharing a brief stretch of road. Then I noticed his hands. The interior cab lights illuminated them as he adjusted his seatbelt, and I saw dark stains covering his palms and fingers. They were brown-red, the unmistakable color of dried blood. Not fresh blood, but blood that had been there long enough to oxidize and darken. My stomach clenched immediately. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd been working on a car and cut himself. Maybe he'd been hunting. But something primal in my brain started screaming danger. And I realized I'd just invited a complete stranger into an enclosed space, traveling 60 miles per hour through isolated mountains in the middle of the night. His demeanor changed within minutes. The grateful politeness evaporated, replaced by something cold and commanding. He started giving me directions, telling me to take upcoming turns onto county roads I'd never heard of. I told him I needed to stay on Route 191, that I had a delivery schedule to maintain. His voice dropped lower, became harder. He repeated his instruction to turn right at the next intersection. When I protested again, he pulled a hunting knife from inside his jacket and held it casually, not threatening me directly, but making its presence impossible to ignore. The blade was at least 6 inches long, and even in the dim light I could see dark stains along the steel that matched the stains on his hands. My mind raced through options. I was trapped in a moving vehicle with an armed man who clearly had experience with violence. Screaming wouldn't help. There was nobody around for miles. Fighting him while driving would likely send us off one of those mountain cliffs. Stopping the truck would give him complete control, so I kept driving, pretending to follow his directions while desperately trying to formulate a plan. He directed me through a series of turns that took us onto progressively smaller roads, away from Route 191. At one point, I recognized a landmark and realized we'd somehow doubled back. We were heading south again, despite him supposedly wanting to go north to Safford. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that he had no intention of letting me survive this night. He started talking more as we drove, his voice taking on a strange, almost conversational quality, despite the knife in his hand. He talked about other drivers he'd met, about how lonely the highways were, about how easy it was to disappear in the vast, empty spaces of the Southwest. He never explicitly threatened me, but the implication was clear in every word. This man had done this before. The blood on his hands wasn't from a car repair or hunting accident. He was hunting humans, and I was his current prey. He kept giving me directions toward what he called the drop point, and my imagination filled in what that meant with horrible clarity. I had one advantage. I knew this truck intimately after 6 years of long-haul driving. I knew its weight, its handling, its braking capacity. And I knew we were approaching a particularly sharp hairpin turn, one I'd navigated carefully dozens of times before. In the seconds before we reached that turn, I made my decision. I would rather risk dying in a crash than let him take me to whatever drop point he had planned. At least in a crash, there was a chance I'd survive. At his destination, I was certain I wouldn't. As we approached the hairpin turn, I suddenly jerked the steering wheel hard left while simultaneously slamming the air brakes with full force. The physics of an 18-wheeler hauling 60,000 pounds of copper ore are unforgiving. The trailer immediately began jackknifing, swinging around toward the cab with massive momentum. The truck became a pivoting disaster sliding across both lanes. I deliberately created exactly the kind of catastrophic brake failure that trucking safety videos warned against. But I'd done it on purpose, using the truck itself as a weapon against my passenger. The violence of the maneuver was extraordinary. Both of us were thrown against our seatbelts with crushing force. The knife flew from his hand and clattered somewhere in the cab. The truck completed most of its jackknife before sliding off the road, tipping partially, then slamming back down with a metal screaming crash that shattered windows and crumpled body panels. The cab door on his side tore partially open from the impact. Somehow, neither of us was knocked unconscious, though I felt the sharp pain of broken ribs and tasted blood in my mouth. We both scrambled to escape the wrecked cab at the same time. He recovered faster than I did, probably because adrenaline and survival instinct override injury. I pulled myself out through the driver's side door and half fell to the asphalt. He came around the front of the truck and I saw he'd retrieved his knife. There was no more pretense of politeness now, just pure murderous intent in his expression. We were both injured, both desperate, both fighting for survival on that dark mountain highway, with the wrecked truck bleeding diesel fuel and the smell of burning rubber thick in the freezing air. I remembered the tire iron I kept clipped inside the driver's door storage compartment. I grabbed it as he approached, and what followed was brutal and graceless. There was no elegant self-defense technique, no choreographed fighting. It was two injured people attacking each other with primitive weapons on cold asphalt in the middle of nowhere. He had military or hunting training. His movements were practiced despite his injuries. I had desperation and the weight advantage of the 3-foot steel tire iron. The fight lasted maybe 2 minutes, though it felt like hours. I connected with his skull, and he went down hard and didn't get back up. I called 911 with shaking hands, barely able to speak through my broken ribs and shock. I told them my location, that I'd been attacked, that the attacker was down. Then I sat on the cold asphalt next to my destroyed truck and waited for help, watching his motionless form and wondering if I'd just killed a man in self-defense, or if he was still alive. Highway patrol arrived within 20 minutes, followed by ambulances and investigators. He was alive but unconscious, suffering a severe skull fracture and other injuries. I was transported to the hospital with broken ribs, facial trauma, and lacerations. The investigation that followed revealed information that still gives me nightmares. The man I'd picked up was wanted by law enforcement across 3 states. They'd been calling him the 191 killer internally. though the public didn't know because they'd been trying to avoid panic. He was responsible for the murders of at least 3 other truck drivers, and possibly more, over a 14-month period. All had been killed on remote Arizona highways after picking him up. He'd apparently survived in the wilderness between kills, targeting isolated long-haul drivers specifically because their schedules made them difficult to track, and their disappearances weren't immediately noticed. My survival made me the only living victim who could testify against him. The blood on his hands had belonged to a driver who'd been killed just 3 days before I picked him up. I recovered physically within a few months, but I've never recovered psychologically. I left long-haul trucking immediately and now work local routes only. Short deliveries within city limits where I'm home every night. I never drive at night anymore. I never drive through isolated areas, and I absolutely never, under any circumstances, pick up hitchhikers or stop for anyone on the roadside. I still have nightmares about that knife, about his voice giving me directions to the drop point, about what would have happened if I hadn't crashed that truck. Sometimes I wake up reliving those 2 minutes of fighting on the highway, feeling the tire iron connecting with bone, wondering how close I came to being victim number 4. The man is in prison now, serving multiple life sentences without parole. But I know there are others like him out there, hunting the lonely highways, looking for sympathetic drivers, making the same mistake I made. Every time I see a hitchhiker now, I see that polite smile hiding murderous intent, and I keep driving. Have you ever picked up a hitchhiker, or has someone you know had a scary experience with a stranger on the road? I work in HVAC repair, which means I spend most of my days in places nobody else wants to go. Crawl spaces filled with spiders, rooftops in 100-degree heat, basements that smell like mildew and rat droppings. After 8 years in this business, I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. My name is Callahan. I'm 34 years old, and I've seen pretty much every kind of building interior that exists in Arizona. Old schools, abandoned warehouses, condemned hotels, foreclosed houses where the AC died years ago, and everything inside rotted in the desert heat. But what I found in the basement of the old Gila County Hospital in Globe, Arizona during July 2015 wasn't just surprising. It was impossible, and it fundamentally changed how I understand reality. Globe is a former mining town with a population around 7,000. The kind of place where buildings sit empty for years before anyone figures out what to do with them. The hospital had closed 8 months earlier when a newer facility opened on the other side of town. The old building was scheduled for conversion into senior housing, which meant all the infrastructure needed inspection and updating. That's why I got the call. The developers needed someone to assess and repair the climate control system before construction could begin. I showed up on a Tuesday morning in mid-July with my tools, my flashlight, and a set of outdated blueprints that supposedly showed the layout of the basement mechanical systems. The basement was exactly what you'd expect in a building that had been empty for months. Dust everywhere, that particular smell of stale air and slow decay, dimly lit by emergency lighting that was barely functioning. The blueprints showed the HVAC equipment in the northeast corner, so I headed that direction through corridors lined with old storage rooms and utility closets. Most of the doors were open, revealing empty spaces or boxes of abandoned medical supplies. Nothing unusual. I was maybe 20 minutes into my inspection when I found the door that wasn't on the blueprints. It was reinforced, heavy steel construction, the kind of door you'd expect on a walk-in freezer or a pharmaceutical storage room. There was a faded sign bolted to it that read, "Preservation, Authorized Personnel," in lettering that looked like it dated from the 1970s. The door wasn't locked. The handle turned easily, and when I pulled it open, cold air rushed out into the corridor. Not just cool air, but genuinely cold, maybe 50 degrees colder than the ambient basement temperature. That immediately caught my attention, because the building had been without power for 8 months. There was no reason for any room to be that cold unless it had its own independent cooling system still running. I stepped inside and found myself in what looked like a perfectly preserved 1970s medical laboratory. There were examination tables with cracked vinyl surfaces, metal storage shelves lined with glass containers, old monitoring equipment with analog dials and switches, even a desk with papers still scattered across its surface. Everything was covered in thick dust except for the examination tables, which were oddly clean, their surfaces gleaming under fluorescent lights that were somehow still functioning despite the building having no power. The whole scene felt frozen in time, like someone had walked out 30 years ago and nobody had entered since. The glass containers on the shelving units were what made my skin crawl. There were dozens of them, ranging from small specimen jars to gallon-sized containers, and they were filled with preserved human tissue. I'm not a medical professional, but I've seen enough horror movies to recognize organs and tissue samples when I see them. What disturbed me wasn't just their presence, but their condition. The preservation fluid inside the jars was crystal clear, and the tissue itself looked fresh. Not decades-old yellowed specimens, but pink and healthy-looking, as if they'd been placed in those containers recently. Some of the larger jars contained what appeared to be complete organs, hearts and livers, and things I couldn't immediately identify, all floating in clear liquid and looking disturbingly alive. I should have left immediately and reported what I'd found to the hospital administration or the police, but professional curiosity and a genuine need to understand what I was looking at kept me in that room. I started examining the space more carefully, trying to make sense of it. The equipment looked functional. Some of the monitoring devices had indicator lights glowing despite the supposed lack of power. The temperature in the room was being maintained by some system I couldn't locate. And those tissue samples were preserved far better than anything sitting in an abandoned building for decades should be. Then I saw movement. It was subtle. Just a shift in my peripheral vision, but I was certain something had moved behind the rows of specimen jars on the shelving unit. I stood completely still, watching, and saw it again. The tissue inside one of the larger containers was contracting and expanding like muscle tissue flexing or lung tissue breathing, not floating passively in fluid, but actively moving with deliberate rhythm. I stepped closer, my rational mind insisting it must be some kind of fluid circulation or temperature differential creating the illusion of movement. But the closer I got, the more obvious it became that what I was seeing was genuine biological activity. The tissue was alive. I started checking other containers, and the same phenomenon appeared throughout the collection. Tissue samples that should have been dead for decades were exhibiting what looked like cellular activity. Some were pulsing rhythmically. Others seemed to be growing, pressing against the glass of their containers. One jar contained what might have been cardiac tissue, and I could see it contracting in steady beats, as if an invisible heart was still pumping blood through non-existent vessels. The impossibility of it crashed over me. Preserved human tissue doesn't remain viable for weeks, let alone decades. Yet here were samples exhibiting life despite being severed from any body, any blood supply, any logical source of continued function. I found a logbook on the desk, a thick binder with entries dating back to 1972. The handwriting changed over the years, suggesting multiple researchers had contributed to it, but the content remained consistent. Detailed observations of tissue preservation experiments, cellular regeneration studies, attempts to maintain organ viability outside the human body. The entries describe success beyond what should be medically possible, tissue samples maintaining function for years, decades even, with no degradation. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before I entered that room. It read, "Continuation of cellular observation protocol. Sample 47C shows increased activity. No degradation after 41 years of preservation. Remarkable sustainability continues." 3 weeks ago. But the building had been closed and empty for 8 months. Nobody should have been accessing that basement, let alone conducting research and recording observations. I checked the date twice, thinking I'd misread it. But there was no mistake. Someone had been in this room documenting these impossible specimens. Just 21 days before, I stumbled through that unlocked door. The implications made my hand shake. Either someone was illegally accessing a closed building to continue unauthorized medical research, or something far stranger was happening. The sound started then, a rhythmic tapping against glass coming from multiple locations around the room. I spun around and saw tissue samples responding to my presence, pressing against their containers as if trying to reach me. The tapping increased in frequency and intensity, dozens of specimens moving in synchronization, creating a chorus of glass percussion that filled the cold room with urgent, purposeful sound. That's when my survival instinct finally overrode my curiosity. I grabbed my phone, took several quick photos of the room, the specimens, and the logbook, then got out of there as fast as I could move. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck in the parking lot, doors locked, hands still shaking. I called my dispatch and told them I'd found something in the hospital basement that required immediate attention from administration and possibly law enforcement. I refused to go back inside. My supervisor was annoyed but agreed to contact the hospital's property management. Within 2 hours, I got a call asking me to meet with hospital administrators and police at the building. I drove back, dreading having to enter that basement again, but determined to show them what I'd discovered. The preservation room was empty. Completely, utterly empty. The reinforced door was still there, still marked with the faded Preservation Authorized Personnel sign, but when police opened it, there was nothing inside except an empty concrete room with old file cabinets against one wall. No examination tables, no shelving units, no specimen jars, no equipment, no desk, no logbook. Just bare walls, dusty floor, and those file cabinets containing nothing but decades-old administrative paperwork. The room was the same size and shape I remembered, but everything else had vanished. Even the temperature was normal, matching the rest of the basement with no trace of that Arctic chill I'd felt. I showed them my phone photos, but they showed the same thing. Empty room, file cabinets, nothing more. The images I'd clearly captured of specimen jars and equipment had somehow transformed into pictures of bare concrete and dust. The photo of the logbook was just a blurry shot of a file cabinet. Police searched the entire basement and found no evidence of medical equipment, tissue samples, or any research activity. Hospital administration reviewed their records and found no documentation of any preservation laboratory ever existing in that building, though they acknowledged the building was old enough that some historical records might be incomplete. The official conclusion was that I'd experienced some kind of episode, possibly caused by exposure to toxic fumes or gases in the poorly ventilated basement. They suggested carbon monoxide or methane buildup could cause vivid hallucinations. They were professional and sympathetic, but clear in their assessment that what I'd experienced wasn't real. The police investigation was closed within 48 hours due to lack of evidence. I was cleared to return to work after a medical evaluation showed no lasting effects from supposed gas exposure. But I know what I saw. Those specimen jars were real. That tissue was moving with impossible life. That logbook documented decades of research with an entry from 3 weeks prior. The cold in that room was physical, not hallucinatory. And most disturbing of all, everything vanished between the time I left and the time I returned with authorities, as if someone or something had hours to remove all evidence of what had been there. I quit taking jobs in buildings with basements. I refused to return to the hospital property even after construction began. I still have nightmares about tissue pressing against glass, about that tapping sound, about the pristine condition of specimens that should have decayed 30 years ago. The questions haunt me more than the memory itself. If I hallucinated the entire experience, why was my hallucination so detailed and consistent? Why did it include specific elements like a logbook with dates and entries I couldn't have invented? But if it was real, where did everything go? Who removed it all in the hours between my visits? And most terrifying of all, if someone was conducting that research in secret for decades, maintaining those impossible tissue samples through some method beyond known medical science, are they still out there somewhere, continuing their work? I'll never know the answers, but I've learned to avoid questions that might lead me back into basements where preservation means something far more disturbing than keeping specimens from decay. What's the most unexplainable thing you've discovered in a place you were working? My name is Sai, and photography has been my life's work for the past 15 years. I specialize in documenting historical sites across the American Southwest, preserving visual records of places that time is slowly erasing. Abandoned structures, forgotten railways, crumbling adobe missions, ghost towns where tumbleweeds outnumber people. It's solitary work that takes me to remote locations most photographers never consider, and I've learned to appreciate the silence and isolation that comes with capturing decay before it becomes complete erasure. In October 2019, I accepted a grant to photograph Route 66 landmarks throughout Arizona, which brought me to Winslow, a town of roughly 9,000 residents that still carries the architectural DNA of its railway heyday. Winslow's claim to fame is La Posada Hotel, a magnificently restored Harvey house that once provided elegant accommodation for transcontinental railway passengers in the 1930s and 40s. The hotel itself operates as a thriving business today, but the surrounding service structures tell a different story. Old Santa Fe railway maintenance buildings, switching yards, freight facilities, all the unglamorous infrastructure that kept trains running on schedule. These spaces have been abandoned for decades. Brick walls still stand, but roofs have collapsed. Windows are empty frames, and desert vegetation grows through cracked concrete floors. These ruins fascinated me precisely because they represented the invisible labor that made railway glamour possible. I secured permission from property management to photograph these structures during optimal lighting conditions. October in Arizona offers perfect weather for outdoor photography, and I plan my shoots around golden hour, that brief window when late afternoon sun transforms everything it touches. On my first evening at the site, I arrived around 5 o'clock and worked systematically through the complex, composing shots that emphasize the relationship between industrial architecture and natural reclamation. I was using professional digital equipment, high-resolution sensor, excellent performance in challenging light, the kind of camera that captures extraordinary detail. Back at my hotel that night, reviewing the day's work on my laptop, I noticed something that stopped me cold. One photograph showed a figure standing in the window of a locked maintenance building. A man wearing period clothing from approximately the 1940s, complete with railway uniform, cap, vest, and what appeared to be a clipboard in his hands. The figure was absolutely clear in my image, detailed enough that I could distinguish individual buttons and see a pocket watch chain. But I remembered that window being empty when I shot the frame. I'd looked through my viewfinder, composed carefully, adjusted exposure settings, pressed the shutter. There had been nobody visible. I examined other images from that session and found him in multiple photographs, always in different positions, always performing tasks. In one frame, he stood at a different window, consulting papers. In another, he appeared to be signaling toward empty tracks. Each photograph showed him engaged in activities consistent with railway operations from 70 years ago. Yet I had absolutely no memory of seeing him while actually taking these shots. The figure existed only in my final images, invisible during the moments I was composing and shooting. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept cycling through possible explanations. Someone trespassing in the buildings without my knowledge. Reflection, or lens flare, creating human-like shapes. Digital artifacts from my sensor. But none of these theories survived scrutiny. The figure was too detailed, too consistent, too obviously human to be visual noise or technical malfunction. And his clothing was historically accurate for railway personnel from a specific era, not the kind of detail a random trespasser would coincidentally match. I returned the next afternoon determined to understand what my camera was capturing. This time I paid obsessive attention while shooting, checking my viewfinder and immediately reviewing each image on my display screen. The pattern held. Buildings appeared empty through my viewfinder, but the resulting photographs showed that same figure, performing different tasks in different locations. He moved between structures, carried equipment, gestured toward invisible trains. My camera was recording something that existed outside the visible spectrum my eyes could perceive. Research became my obsession. I spent the following morning at local museums, digging through Santa Fe Railway archives, personnel records, historical photographs. Museum staff proved incredibly helpful, providing access to employment documents and operational records from the railway's peak decades. That's where I identified him. Station Master William Hartley, employed from 1925 until his death in 1947. His personnel photograph matched my mysterious figure exactly. Same facial features, same build, even that distinctive pocket watch chain. The accident report documented his death during overnight switching operations, crushed between freight cars while on duty. But here's what made my skin crawl. His employment records showed him listed as working regular shifts for 3 full months after his documented death date. Someone had continued filing his time cards, recording his hours, documenting his presence at work long after he'd been buried. When confronted about the discrepancy, his supervisor claimed clerical error, but internal investigation notes mentioned multiple workers reporting they'd seen William at his post during those months, assuming he'd survived the accident. Several testified to receiving instructions from him, watching him perform his duties. The investigation dismissed these as grief hallucinations. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the site after dark, bringing my equipment and enough batteries for extended shooting. Night photography requires longer exposures, and I hoped darkness might strengthen whatever phenomenon my camera was capturing. I set up my tripod in the empty lot, where switching yards once operated, and began shooting. What I saw through my viewfinder that night exceeded anything I'd captured in daylight. Not just William Hartley, but an entire spectral railway operation overlaying the empty modern landscape. Workers moved between buildings. Trains arrived and departed from tracks that no longer existed. Steam and diesel exhaust drifted through my frame despite clear air. I was witnessing 1947 superimposed on 2019, visible only through my camera's lens. Then William Hartley looked directly at me. His eyes found my position 70 years across time, acknowledging my presence through the viewfinder. He walked toward me, his approach captured in my rapid shooting sequence, crossing the distance between his era and mine. When he reached my exact location, he stopped and mouthed words I couldn't hear but could clearly read. "Help me." His expression carried desperation, anguish, a plea for release from some obligation he couldn't escape. This wasn't residual energy or recorded history. This was conscious awareness trapped in endless repetition. I began researching his descendants, using genealogy databases and county records. Eventually, I connected with his grandson living in Flagstaff. When I explained I'd been capturing photographic evidence of his grandfather at the old railway site, his response surprised me. No skepticism, no dismissal. Their family had stories passed down through generations about William's inability to rest, about duty and dedication so profound that even death couldn't make him abandon his post. Family members had visited the site over decades, feeling his presence, though none had captured visual proof like my photographs provided. The grandson asked if I would consider organizing a memorial ceremony, something the family had long discussed but never accomplished. I agreed immediately. We arranged a gathering for early November, keeping it intimate with just family members, a few local historians, and someone from current Amtrak operations. I printed large format versions of my photographs, physical evidence that William Hartley's service hadn't been forgotten. We installed a memorial plaque at the site acknowledging his 22 years with the Santa Fe Railway and his contributions to Winslow's community. The ceremony was simple and dignified. Family members spoke about his reputation for reliability, his pride in professional excellence, his identity shaped entirely by commitment to duty. After that memorial, everything changed. I continued photographing the railway sites for weeks afterward, returning dozens of times to complete my documentation project. William Hartley never appeared in my photographs again. The spectral operation ceased manifesting through my camera. The buildings remained empty ruins, historically significant but no longer portals to the past. I've analyzed this endlessly, questioning whether the memorial released him from whatever kept him working beyond death, or whether my equipment simply stopped revealing that particular layer of reality. The experience fundamentally altered my approach to preservation photography. I've expanded my projects to specifically identify and memorialize forgotten workers, people whose labor created the historical significance we're now documenting, but whose individual contributions went unrecorded. I research their names, document their service, arrange recognition when possible. It feels important in ways I never considered before encountering William. These weren't just buildings. They were workplaces where real people spent their lives, where dedication and skill created something larger than themselves. They deserve acknowledgement as individuals. I still photograph the Winslow sites regularly, and sometimes I feel watched while working there. Not threatening or disturbing, but protective, like someone maintaining connection to their former workplace with continued pride. I interpret this as William's presence in some gentler form, no longer trapped in repetition, but perhaps still anchored to the place that defined his existence. Whether that's genuine spiritual phenomenon or my psychological response to empty spaces doesn't concern me much anymore. The experience taught me that places carry memory, that human effort leaves impressions beyond physical evidence, and that recognition matters even across decades of separation. My photographs from that project have been exhibited throughout Arizona. The images capturing William always generate the most discussion, sparking conversations about memory, what we owe to the past, and whether technology can reveal hidden dimensions of reality. Some viewers insist they're hoaxes or digital manipulation. Others find them profoundly moving evidence of persistence beyond death. I don't defend or explain. I simply present what my camera recorded and share the story of how a memorial seemed to offer peace to someone working the same shift 70 years after dying at his post. Photography captures light, but sometimes it captures far more. My equipment revealed layers of existence beyond normal perception, made visible through the specific technology of digital sensors and electronic shutters. I'm grateful for that revelation, even though I still don't fully understand the mechanics of what occurred. William Hartley worked his entire life maintaining railway operations with precision and dedication. Perhaps that commitment was strong enough to persist beyond biological limitation, and perhaps all he needed was acknowledgement that his service mattered. I was honored to provide that recognition, and I carry the experience with me in every project since. History isn't just buildings and dates, it's people. And sometimes those people are still present in ways we can only perceive when we're paying attention with the right tools. Tell me about a time when technology showed you something unexpected that changed how you see the world. My name is Liam, and until April 2022, I made my living as a field geologist working for a mining survey company out of Phoenix. The job took me to some of the most remote and desolate locations across Arizona, places where abandoned mining operations had left their scars on the landscape decades or even a century ago. I collected soil samples, tested for contamination, assessed whether old sites might be worth reopening based on current mineral prices and extraction technology. It was scientific work, measurable and predictable, governed by chemistry and geology and mathematics. I spent weeks alone in the field, camping near ghost towns and collapsed mine shafts, surrounded by nothing but desert silence and the physical evidence of human industry that had moved on generations before I was born. That all ended at the Metcalfe site near Morenci, where I encountered something that defied every scientific principle I'd built my career upon. Morenci sits in eastern Arizona's Copper Corridor, a region that's been producing copper since the 1870s. The town itself barely holds 1,400 residents, most connected to current mining operations. But surrounding the active mines are dozens of abandoned sites where earlier generations extracted ore until the deposits ran thin or better locations were discovered. Metcalfe was one of these ghost operations, active from the 1870s through the early 1900s before being left to the desert. My company had been contracted to survey the site for a mining conglomerate considering whether modern extraction methods might make reopening economically viable. That meant I needed to spend 3 weeks documenting current conditions, measuring residual environmental contamination, and collecting comprehensive geological samples across the entire property. I established my camp in mid-April, about a mile from the main cluster of collapsed structures and sealed mine entrances. The Metcalfe site sprawled across several square miles of harsh terrain, mostly exposed rock with sparse vegetation and massive tailings piles where waste material had been dumped over decades of operation. Copper staining was visible everywhere, that distinctive blue-green mineral patina coating exposed stone surfaces. I worked methodically, dividing the site into a grid and systematically collecting samples from each section, documenting everything with GPS coordinates, photographs, and detailed field notes. By the end of my first week, I'd processed maybe a quarter of the total area, standard progress for this type of survey. The incident occurred while I was examining a collapsed shaft entrance on the property's eastern boundary. The opening had caved in long ago, leaving a depression surrounded by rotting timber supports and broken stone. I was photographing the exposed rock face, noting the visible copper mineralization, when I reached out to steady myself against the stone. My bare hand contacted a section of exposed copper ore, and immediately I felt something wrong. Not pain exactly, but a tingling sensation that shot up my forearm like electricity, followed by numbness that spread from my palm to my elbow. I pulled my hand back and examined it, expecting to find I'd cut myself on sharp rock or been stung by something. But there was no visible injury, just that strange tingling that gradually faded over the next few minutes. I thought nothing more of it until that evening back at camp. While preparing dinner, I noticed discoloration on my right hand, the one that had touched the copper ore. The skin across my palm and fingers had developed a faint greenish-blue tint, subtle but definitely not normal. I scrubbed my hands thoroughly, assuming I'd gotten mineral dust on my skin that had stained it. But the discoloration didn't fade. If anything, it seemed slightly more pronounced after washing. I made a note in my field journal to monitor it, figuring it was probably a harmless reaction to copper compounds that would resolve on its own. Over the next 3 days, the discoloration spread. It crept up my forearm in irregular patches, that same greenish-blue color intensifying and covering more surface area. The affected skin felt different too, slightly harder than normal, less flexible. I maintained my decontamination protocols religiously, showering thoroughly each evening, wearing gloves during sample collection, avoiding direct contact with mineral deposits. None of it made any difference. The discoloration continued spreading, and the skin texture continued changing, becoming rougher and more rigid. By the end of the second week, my entire right arm from fingertips to elbow had transformed into something that resembled copper patina more than human flesh. I drove into Morenci and visited the urgent care clinic, where a physician examined my arm with visible confusion. She'd never seen anything like it. Blood tests showed elevated copper levels, but not dramatically so. Certainly not enough to explain the physical manifestation on my skin. She prescribed chelation therapy to reduce copper in my bloodstream and referred me to a dermatologist in Tucson, recommending I leave the field site immediately. I refused to abandon the project with only a week remaining, convincing myself the medical intervention would reverse whatever was happening. That was a mistake driven by professional pride and complete failure to understand what I was dealing with. The transformation accelerated. Within days, both arms showed the discoloration and hardening. My skin developed a crystalline quality in places, reflecting light like polished metal. Flexibility decreased dramatically. Bending my fingers became difficult and painful. The affected areas lost sensation entirely. Couldn't feel temperature or pressure or texture. I looked at my hands and saw something inhuman, something that violated basic biology. Human skin doesn't turn into metal. Cells don't incorporate elemental copper in ways that change tissue into mineral. Yet that's exactly what was happening to my body, progressing despite medical intervention and every rational explanation I could construct. Desperate for answers, I contacted the Apache Reservation Office for the San Carlos Apache tribe, whose traditional territory included the Metcalf area. I explained I was experiencing health issues possibly related to the old mining site, and asked if tribal elders had any historical knowledge about the location. After some hesitation, they connected me with an elder who agreed to meet. When he saw my arms, his expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. He told me the Metcalf site had been considered dangerous long before white miners arrived, that Apache tradition warned against disturbing certain places where the earth itself carried curses. When early miners excavated the main shafts in the 1870s, they destroyed burial sites, desecrating Apache dead in their pursuit of copper. According to tribal memory, several miners had died from an affliction that turned their skin to copper, their bodies found rigid and metallic, transformed by something the Apache understood as the Earth's retribution for violation. He explained this wasn't medical, wasn't something white doctors could treat with their medicines and procedures. This was spiritual consequence, the land itself responding to desecration by incorporating the violators into the substance they'd been so eager to extract. The transformation I was experiencing had historical precedent, documented in tribal oral tradition and in scattered mining company records from the 1870s that attributed deaths to mineral poisoning without understanding the true nature of what killed those men. He offered to perform a traditional Apache cleansing ceremony at the site, warning that it might halt the progression but couldn't reverse what had already occurred. I had no other options. Medical science had failed completely. We returned to Metcalf 3 days later, accompanied by 2 other tribal members who would assist in the ceremony. They brought sage, tobacco, other materials I didn't recognize, and they worked for hours at the site where I'd first touched the exposed copper ore. The elder chanted in Apache, his voice carrying across the empty desert, while smoke from burning herbs drifted over the collapsed shaft and the surrounding ground. I sat at the center of the ritual space, my transformed arms extended, watching my hands that no longer looked like hands. The ceremony felt ancient, connected to knowledge systems completely outside my scientific training, addressing forces I'd never believed existed. When it concluded, the elder told me the transformation would progress no further, but what had already changed would remain. He described it as a permanent mark, a scar carried as reminder of boundaries transgressed and powers that exist beyond human measurement. He was right. The discoloration and hardening stopped that day, frozen at roughly 60% of my body's surface area. Both arms completely affected, patches across my chest and neck, spreading down my right leg. The transformation halted but never reversed, despite every medical intervention attempted over subsequent months. I left geology entirely, unable to continue fieldwork with limited mobility and permanent disfigurement. I took an administrative position with an environmental consulting firm, desk work processing reports other geologists submitted from sites I could no longer visit. The affected skin remains metallic, greenish-blue, completely numb to sensation. Medical documentation describes my case as unexplained dermatological condition with unknown etiology because admitting what actually happened would require acknowledging realities outside conventional medical framework. Tissue biopsies showed cellular incorporation of copper at levels and in configurations that shouldn't be biologically possible. My cells literally integrating metal into organic structures in ways that violate known biochemistry. I've become an advocate for consulting tribal authorities before conducting operations on lands with indigenous history. Not because I've suddenly become spiritual or mystical, but because I experienced firsthand that there are forces operating in this world that Western science cannot measure, predict, or control. The Apache elder knew immediately what was happening to me based on traditional knowledge maintained across generations. His intervention stopped the transformation when medical doctors couldn't even properly diagnose what was occurring. That practical result matters more than any theoretical debate about whether what happened was curse, contamination, or something else entirely. I still have nightmares about watching my hands turn to metal, about the creeping loss of sensation as skin hardened into something mineral rather than organic. The permanent scars I carry are visible reminders that human arrogance has consequences, that treating land purely as resource to be exploited ignores deeper relationships and older claims than property law recognizes. Whether you interpret my experience as spiritual punishment, environmental contamination with properties science hasn't documented, or psychological manifestation of guilt doesn't particularly concern me. I know what happened to my body. I know medical science couldn't stop it. And I know a traditional Apache ceremony halted progression that every doctor said should be impossible in the first place. The Metcalf site remains abandoned, though the mining conglomerate ultimately decided against attempting to reopen it. I'd like to think my report influenced that decision, though they probably based it purely on economic calculations rather than any concern about curses or consequences. I never returned to the location after the ceremony, and I never will. The copper-colored scarring across my body is connection enough to that place. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the transformation had continued unchecked, if my entire body had converted to metallic mineral, if I'd have died or become something else entirely. I'm grateful I never had to find out, but the question haunts me regardless. If your job required entering places marked dangerous by those who lived there first, would you listen to their warnings? My name is Berkeley, and for 3 years I worked the overnight shift at Copper Hills Motor Lodge in Wilcox, Arizona. Wilcox is a small ranching community of maybe 3,600 people situated along Interstate 10, the kind of place most travelers pass through without noticing except to fill their gas tanks or grab fast food. The motel catered primarily to truckers and interstate travelers looking for cheap overnight accommodation between El Paso and Tucson. Working the 11 at night to 7 in the morning shift meant long hours of quiet punctuated by occasional check-ins, handling minor guest complaints, restocking the breakfast area, and doing paperwork. It was solitary, repetitive work that suited me perfectly. I'm naturally introverted, comfortable with silence and routine. The night shift offered decent pay for relatively simple tasks, and I settled into the rhythm easily. That comfortable routine shattered in November 2017 when I began noticing discrepancies between my memories and the security footage. Discrepancies that eventually revealed I'd been experiencing something profoundly wrong for months without realizing it. The first incident I remember clearly happened on a Tuesday night, unusually slow even by our standards. Around 1 in the morning, a guest approached the front desk asking to check in. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing a road-worn jacket, carrying a single duffel bag. We exchanged the standard pleasantries while I processed his registration. He paid cash for room 14, signed the guest log, and I handed him a key card. We chatted briefly about road conditions on I-10 before he headed to his room. Standard interaction, completely unremarkable, the type of check-in I'd handled hundreds of times before. What made it remarkable happened 2 hours later, when I reviewed security footage from that evening while investigating a separate issue with the parking lot cameras. The footage from the front desk showed me performing the check-in procedure. I watched myself typing on the computer, swiping a credit card reader, printing a receipt, handing over a key card. But there was no guest visible in the frame. The camera angle captured the entire front desk area clearly, yet it showed me interacting with empty space. I watched myself speaking to nobody, listened to audio of my voice having a one-sided conversation, saw my hands extending a key card to a person who wasn't there. The timestamp matched my memory exactly. Room 14 had been occupied that night according to my records, but the security footage documented me checking in a guest who didn't exist on camera. I convinced myself it was a technical glitch, maybe a camera malfunction that failed to capture the guest while recording everything else in the frame. That explanation satisfied me until the following week, when I decided to review more footage systematically. What I discovered made my stomach drop. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the previous 4 months, I'd checked in dozens of guests who appeared in my memory and in the written records, but were completely invisible on security footage. The camera showed me speaking to empty space, processing payments from nobody, handing keys to the air, yet the guest log contained their signatures. The register showed their room assignments. Cash appeared in the drawer, corresponding to their payments. Every administrative record confirmed these people had checked in and stayed overnight. Only the video evidence contradicted it. I began obsessively comparing my memories against footage every shift, trying to understand what was happening. The pattern was disturbingly clear. Roughly 40% of the guests I remembered checking in weren't visible on camera. My interactions with them seemed completely normal in my memory. Detailed conversations about where they were traveling, whether they needed recommendations for breakfast places, if the room had adequate amenities. But video showed me having these conversations with nobody. I'd watch footage of myself nodding and responding to statements I apparently couldn't hear because there was nobody speaking. I was performing elaborate social interactions with people who either didn't exist or existed in some way the cameras couldn't record. The implications terrified me. Either I was experiencing massive dissociative episodes, hallucinating entire interactions while performing my job automatically, or something stranger was occurring. I started keeping detailed contemporaneous notes during my shifts, writing down every guest interaction immediately after it happened, including physical descriptions and conversation specifics. Then I'd compare those notes against video footage. The discrepancies remained consistent. I'd have clear written records of checking in someone, detailed descriptions of their appearance and our conversation, but video would show me alone at the desk performing check-in procedures with nobody present. I brought the discrepancy to my manager's attention, showing him side-by-side comparisons of guest log entries and corresponding security footage. He reviewed the evidence with increasing concern, though his interpretation differed from mine. He saw someone experiencing serious medical issues, possibly neurological problems causing elaborate hallucinations. He strongly recommended I see a doctor immediately and offered to adjust my schedule to accommodate medical appointments. I agreed, partly because I was terrified of what might be wrong with me, partly because I needed medical explanations to make sense of what I was experiencing. The neurological workup revealed something unexpected. I was experiencing complex partial seizures, a condition where abnormal electrical activity in the brain creates realistic auditory and visual hallucinations while the person remains conscious and continues performing routine tasks automatically. During these episodes, I would hallucinate entire guest interactions, complete conversations, and visual details of people who weren't there, while simultaneously performing actual check-in procedures from muscle memory. The seizures explained why I had detailed memories of interactions that never occurred, why I could describe guests who didn't exist, why video showed me speaking to empty space. My brain was generating false experiences that felt completely real, indistinguishable from genuine memories. Treatment involved anti-seizure medication and regular monitoring. The episodes decreased in frequency and eventually stopped entirely, but the experience left me with profound questions I couldn't answer. The medication explained my hallucinations and resolved the medical issue. What it couldn't explain was the physical evidence. The guest log contained signatures I didn't write. My handwriting is distinctive, and these signatures were clearly different hands, different styles, names I'd never written before. The cash register contained extra money corresponding exactly to payments from guests I'd apparently hallucinated. Security footage showed me placing cash in the drawer and making change, but that money came from somewhere. If the guests weren't real, where did their payment money originate? I raised these questions with my neurologist, who suggested that during seizure episodes, I might have been writing signatures myself in dissociative states, or that the cash discrepancies had mundane explanations like calculation errors or guests I'd forgotten about. But neither explanation satisfied the evidence. I tested my handwriting extensively, trying to reproduce those signatures. I couldn't match them. The writing styles were too different from my own, and the cash amounts were too precisely correlated with specific hallucinated check-ins to be random errors. Room 14 guest supposedly paid $38 cash. Extra $38 appeared in the register that night. This pattern repeated across dozens of incidents. The motel owner conducted an internal audit, trying to account for the cash discrepancies, eventually concluding that record-keeping errors over months had created confusion that couldn't be untangled. They wrote off the extra money rather than continue investigating, but I knew what I documented. Guests who existed in every record except video surveillance had paid money that physically appeared in the register. Either I was checking in real people who somehow avoided being captured on camera, or my seizure-induced hallucinations were generating physical evidence that persisted after the episodes ended. Neither explanation made rational sense. I left my position at the motel 6 months after the diagnosis. The seizures were controlled by medication, but I couldn't continue working there, haunted by unanswered questions. Every time I looked at the front desk, I remembered watching myself on camera interacting with people who weren't visible, remembered conversations that apparently never happened, remembered making change for payments that shouldn't have existed. The boundary between real memory and hallucinated experience had blurred beyond my ability to separate them. How many of my memories from those 3 years were genuine? How many guests actually existed versus existing only in my seizure-distorted perception? The psychological impact of losing faith in your own memory is difficult to articulate. I'd lived my entire life trusting that my memories corresponded to real events, that what I remembered happening had actually occurred. The seizure diagnosis demolished that trust. If I could hallucinate months of detailed guest interactions indistinguishable from real experiences, What else in my life might be false memory generated by brain malfunction? The neurologist assured me the seizures had been limited to specific periods and that medication had resolved the underlying condition. But that reassurance couldn't restore my confidence in memory itself. I moved away from Wilcox entirely, taking a customer service position in Tucson that involved daytime hours and no overnight isolation. I've been seizure-free for several years now. Medical monitoring confirms the condition is controlled and unlikely to recur. But I still struggle with the unanswered questions from those months at Copper Hills Motor Lodge. The guest log remains physical evidence of something I cannot explain. I kept photocopies before leaving, documentation of signatures in handwriting I can't reproduce, signatures of people who either were invisible to cameras or never existed at all. Sometimes I study those signatures, trying to determine if they're real or if I wrote them myself during episodes I can't remember. The philosophical implications haunt me more than the medical ones. My neurologist explained the brain malfunction. What he couldn't explain was the persistence of physical evidence. If the seizures were generating hallucinations, those hallucinations were somehow creating artifacts that remained after the episodes ended. Guest signatures, cash payments, written records that existed independently of my perception. Either the boundary between hallucination and reality is more permeable than we acknowledge, or something else was occurring that medical frameworks can't adequately address. Both possibilities disturb me equally. I've become obsessive about documenting my daily life since then, taking photographs with timestamps, keeping detailed journals, creating external verification for my experiences and memories. If I can't fully trust my own perception and recall, I need external evidence to confirm what's real. Friends find this behavior excessive, possibly symptomatic of anxiety disorder stemming from the seizure diagnosis. Maybe they're right. But I know what I experienced in Wilcox. I know the evidence that existed and couldn't be explained. And I know that my understanding of how memory and reality relate to each other was fundamentally shattered by watching security footage of myself speaking to people who weren't there, while physical evidence of their presence appeared in guest logs and cash registers. The Copper Hills Motor Lodge still operates, still serves truckers and travelers passing through Wilcox on Interstate 10. I drive past it occasionally when visiting Tucson, and I always feel a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me wants to stop and review current guest logs, see if the pattern continued after I left, or if it was specific to my seizure episodes. Part of me never wants to enter that building again, never wants to confront the questions I couldn't answer. The medical explanation resolved the immediate crisis and restored my neurological health. But it didn't resolve the mystery of whether I was checking in real guests invisible to cameras or hallucinating guests so vividly that they left physical evidence behind. I'll probably never know the answer. What I do know is that the line between perception and reality is far thinner than I once believed, and that sometimes medical explanations raise more questions than they answer. When your memory contradicts physical evidence, which one do you trust? My name is Noah, and until August 2023, I worked for the Municipal Water Department in St. John's, Arizona, a town of roughly 3,300 people tucked up in the northeastern corner of the state near the New Mexico border. St. John's sits at high elevation surrounded by pine forests and open rangeland, the kind of quiet rural community where everybody knows their neighbors and nothing particularly exciting ever happens. My job involved maintaining the town's water infrastructure, checking meters, repairing broken pipes, and conducting seasonal inspections of the storm drainage system that runs beneath the streets. It was steady work, physically demanding but satisfying, the kind of job where you finish each day having accomplished tangible tasks you can point to. That sense of productive normalcy ended during a routine drainage inspection when my partner Theodore and I discovered something growing in the tunnels beneath St. John's that shouldn't exist anywhere, let alone in a concrete storm drain system. The inspection was scheduled for late August, right after monsoon season, when heavy rains can deposit debris and sediment into the drainage network. Theodore and I had worked together for 3 years, completing these inspections probably a dozen times. The routine was completely standard. We'd enter the system through access points along Main Street, walk through the tunnels with flashlights and inspection equipment, document any blockages or structural issues, clear minor obstructions, and report anything requiring specialized attention. The tunnels themselves were nothing special. Just concrete pipes and channels large enough to walk through in most sections, carrying rainwater from street drains down to collection basins at the edge of town. We expected to find the usual accumulation of branches, trash, maybe some sediment buildup. What we found instead defied any category of normal maintenance issue. We entered through the Main Street access point around 9 in the morning, both of us wearing waders and carrying high-powered flashlights. Theodore with the inspection clipboard and camera, me with tools for clearing minor blockages. The first 100 yards looked completely normal. Standard concrete construction with some water still flowing from recent rains. Nothing unusual. Then Theodore stopped abruptly and aimed his flashlight at the tunnel wall. Something was growing there, covering maybe a 10-foot section of concrete. It looked biological, organic tissue rather than any kind of fungus or mold. The material was pink and purple, semi-translucent in places, with visible vascular structures running through it like blood vessels. It pulsed rhythmically, expanding and contracting as if breathing, as if the tunnel wall itself had developed lungs. I approached cautiously and examined it more closely. The growth was maybe 2 inches thick, spongy to appearance, definitely alive based on the rhythmic pulsing. Theodore asked if I'd ever seen anything like it in previous inspections, and I told him absolutely not. This wasn't algae, wasn't any kind of plant or fungal growth I recognized. It looked like animal tissue, like muscle or organ material somehow growing directly out of the concrete. We documented it thoroughly with photographs and notes, assuming it was some kind of unusual biological contamination that would require specialists to identify and remove. Neither of us was prepared for what we found deeper in the system. As we continued through the tunnels, the growth became more extensive. By the time we'd advanced another couple 100 yards, it covered significant sections of walls and ceiling, creating thick layers that had reduced the tunnel's effective diameter. The pulsing remained consistent across all the growth, synchronized like it was part of a single organism rather than isolated patches, and it was responding to our presence. When we shined flashlights directly on it, the tissue would contract away from the light, pulling back as if avoiding exposure. When we spoke, it would swell slightly, as if reacting to sound vibrations. Theodore wanted to return to the surface immediately and report what we'd found, but department protocol required completing the full inspection route unless we encountered immediate safety hazards. The growth was disturbing but didn't seem actively dangerous, so we continued forward. The chamber we discovered wasn't on the official drainage schematics. We reached a junction where the tunnel should have continued straight according to our maps, but instead we found an opening leading to a large space that wasn't supposed to exist. Theodore checked the blueprints 3 times, insisting there was no chamber at this location, but the opening was undeniable. We entered cautiously and found ourselves in a room maybe 20 feet across, completely lined with the biological growth. It was thick here, several inches deep, covering every surface, like wallpaper made from living tissue. The pulsing was stronger, more pronounced, and the vascular structures were clearly visible, fluid moving through them in rhythmic waves. The air itself felt wrong, humid and warm, despite the cool tunnel temperature elsewhere, carrying a smell that was organic and chemical simultaneously. Then the sound started. Not the ambient dripping and water flow you'd expect in drainage tunnels, but something else. Clicking noises coming from the growth itself, rhythmic patterns that almost sounded like communication, wet breathing sounds despite nothing having respiratory organs, and worst of all, vocalizations that resembled distorted human speech, fragments of words and sounds that approximated language without forming anything coherent. Theodore grabbed my arm and said we needed to leave immediately, that whatever this was fell well outside our job description. I agreed completely, but before we could exit the chamber, we saw movement behind the tissue membrane. Something large was pressing against the growth from the other side, creating bulges and distortions in the organic material. We could see shapes that might have been limbs, structures that resembled fingers or hands pressing outward. A section of the membrane stretched thin enough to become nearly transparent, and through it we saw what looked like a face, or something face-adjacent, with features that suggested eyes and a mouth, but weren't quite right, weren't quite human. The vocalizations increased, multiple sources now, the clicking and breathing and distorted speech overlapping into a chorus of sounds that filled the chamber. Theodore broke first, turned and ran back toward the main tunnel. I was right behind him, both of us abandoning any pretense of professional inspection protocol, just focused on getting out of that space as quickly as possible. We ran through the drainage system faster than we'd ever moved in those tunnels before, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly, the sound of our own breathing and footsteps echoing off concrete. Neither of us looked back to see if anything was following. We just ran until we reached the Main Street access ladder and climbed up into daylight and fresh air and normalcy. Once we were back on the street, Theodore immediately called our supervisor while I sat on the curb trying to slow my heartbeat and process what we'd just experienced. When our supervisor arrived 20 minutes later, we explained everything, showed him our photographs, described the chamber and the biological growth and the things moving behind the tissue membrane. He took our report seriously enough to call in the department director and notify town administration. By early afternoon, a crew was assembled to investigate our claims, including our supervisor, the director, 2 other water department workers, and someone from county environmental health. Theodore and I accompanied them back into the system, retracing our route. We led them through the tunnels to where we'd first seen the growth, to where it had covered the walls and ceiling, to where the chamber should have been. There was nothing there. Clean concrete tunnels, standard construction, no biological growth anywhere. The junction where we'd found the chamber showed only the expected continuation of the drainage pipe, matching the blueprints perfectly. No opening, no room, no organic material coating the walls. The inspection crew thoroughly checked every section we'd documented. They found nothing unusual. No evidence of any biological contamination, no structural anomalies, no chambers that weren't on official schematics. Our photographs had somehow changed as well. Theodore pulled out his camera and reviewed the images we'd taken just hours earlier. They showed normal drainage tunnels, concrete walls, standard infrastructure, no pink and purple tissue, no pulsing organic growth, no vascular structures. The photographic evidence we'd carefully documented had transformed into images of completely ordinary storm drains. Our supervisor asked if we might have been exposed to gases in the tunnels, if we'd felt dizzy or disoriented at any point. Standard procedure when workers report hallucinations underground is to test for methane, carbon monoxide, other contaminants that can cause altered perception. Theodore and I both refused to accept the hallucination explanation. We knew what we'd seen, what we'd heard, what we'd photographed. The growth had been real, physical, responsive to light and sound. The chamber had existed, large enough to stand in line with living tissue. The things moving behind the membrane had pressed against it with enough force to create visible distortions. Shared hallucination didn't explain the consistency of our experience, didn't explain how we'd both seen and heard identical details, but with no physical evidence remaining and photographs that contradicted our testimony, the official conclusion was that we'd experienced some form of environmental exposure, causing temporary perceptual disturbance. I requested immediate transfer to above-ground duties only, refusing to enter the drainage system again under any circumstances. Theodore went further, submitting his resignation within a week and leaving the water department entirely. Neither of us could continue working in those tunnels knowing what we'd encountered, knowing that something was down there even if it had somehow hidden itself from the follow-up inspection. Our supervisor accepted my transfer request and Theodore's resignation without argument, probably relieved that we weren't pushing the issue further or demanding additional investigation. But the story didn't end with our departure from underground work. Over the following months, other water department employees reported strange sounds coming from storm drains, organic smells emanating from access points, unexplained blockages in sections that had recently been inspected and cleared. Nobody else reported seeing the biological growth or the chamber, but the pattern of unusual incidents continued. Town administration responded by sealing several access points, officially citing structural concerns but effectively limiting entry to the drainage system. The sealed accesses included the Main Street point where Theodore and I had entered that August morning. I still work for St. John's Water Department, but exclusively above ground now, maintaining surface infrastructure and avoiding any assignment that would require entering the tunnels. Theodore moved away entirely, taking a job in Phoenix doing commercial plumbing, where everything is visible and accessible and normal. We stay in occasional contact, and sometimes we discuss that day in the drainage system, trying to understand what we experienced. Were we exposed to something that caused shared hallucination? Did we encounter actual biological contamination that was removed before the follow-up inspection could document it? Or is there something living beneath St. John's that can hide itself from observation, that exists in spaces between official maps and photographic evidence? I don't have answers to those questions. What I know is that Theodore and I both experienced something profoundly wrong in those tunnels, something that violated our understanding of what can exist in municipal infrastructure. I know our photographs changed between taking them and reviewing them hours later, documented evidence transforming into images of normal drainage pipes. I know the chamber we entered wasn't on official schematics, but was large and real enough that we both stood inside it. And I know that whatever we encountered is probably still down there, pulsing and breathing and clicking in the darkness beneath the streets, waiting for the next person who ventures deep enough into the system to find it. Sometimes I hear reports of ongoing drainage issues in sections near where we found the chamber, and I wonder if anyone else has seen what Theodore and I saw. I wonder if the town administration knows more than they're sharing, if there have been other incidents they've kept quiet to avoid panic. Mostly I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed in that chamber longer, if those things behind the tissue membrane had managed to push through, if the vocalizations that sounded almost like speech had continued long enough for us to understand what they were trying to say. I'm grateful I'll never know the answers. Grateful that I ran when Theodore ran. Grateful that my job now keeps me in sunlight and fresh air, where things are visible and measurable and make sense according to the rules I learned in training. Would you enter a space that wasn't supposed to exist if you found it? My name is Hunter, and I've worked as a real estate agent for 12 years. Building a successful business handling property sales across central Arizona. The job requires spending extended time in different communities, showing properties, meeting clients, establishing local connections that help facilitate transactions. I'm comfortable with the transient nature of the work, moving between towns for weeks at a time, staying in local inns, becoming temporarily embedded in small communities, before moving on to the next project. In January 2020, I accepted multiple listing assignments in Wickenburg, a historic gold mining town of roughly 7,500 people located northwest of Phoenix. What should have been a straightforward 6-week project became something far stranger when people throughout the town began reporting encounters with me in places I'd never been. At times, I could account for elsewhere, creating a doppelganger phenomenon that eventually drove me from Wickenburg entirely and left me questioning the boundaries between identity and presence. Wickenburg carries the architectural character of its gold rush origins, with historic downtown buildings dating to the late 1800s and a community identity tied to Western heritage and mining history. I'd worked there briefly on previous occasions without incident, but this assignment involved managing simultaneous sales of several commercial properties in the historic district, which meant I'd be present in town for an extended period. I rented a room at a local bed and breakfast, established routines at specific restaurants and coffee shops, became a recognizable figure in the small downtown area where everyone quickly learns everyone else's face. That visibility is usually helpful for business, making me approachable to potential clients. In Wickenburg that January, visibility became profoundly disturbing. The first incident occurred during my second week in town. I was showing a property to potential buyers on the east side of Wickenburg when one of my other clients called, somewhat annoyed, asking why I'd skipped our scheduled appointment. I explained I hadn't skipped anything, that we'd agreed to meet the following day, not today. She insisted we'd confirmed for this afternoon, and that she'd actually seen me at the grocery store an hour earlier and waved, but I'd ignored her and walked away. I checked my calendar thoroughly and confirmed our appointment was indeed scheduled for the next day, not today. And I definitely hadn't been to the grocery store. I'd been showing property continuously for the past 3 hours, with witnesses who could verify my location. I apologized for the confusion, assuming she'd simply misremembered our appointment time and had mistaken someone else for me at the store. But similar incidents multiplied rapidly. Over the next week, I received multiple comments from Wickenburg residents about seeing me in various locations around town. At the library, researching property records, except I'd never been to the Wickenburg Library. At the hardware store, purchasing supplies, except I hadn't needed hardware supplies. At a church service I'd never attended. Each person described specific details, what I'd been wearing, brief conversations we'd supposedly had, interactions they remembered clearly. And their descriptions were accurate to my actual clothing and mannerisms, specific enough that these weren't cases of mistaking a random stranger for me. They were describing someone who looked exactly like me, dressed like me, moved like me, but wasn't me. I started maintaining meticulous documentation of my location and activities, partly to defend against these mistaken identity claims, partly because the frequency was becoming genuinely unsettling. I kept receipts, took time-stamped photographs, maintained detailed calendar entries. When someone would mention seeing me somewhere, I could prove I'd been elsewhere. A coffee shop employee insisted I'd been in that morning ordering my usual drink, having a conversation about weather. My credit card records and photographs proved I'd been 40 miles away in surprise meeting with a commercial property developer at exactly that time. A client swore he'd seen me at the post office, had a brief exchange about shipping packages. My phone's location data showed I'd been at a title company office across town during that window. The phenomenon escalated beyond simple mistaken sightings. People began describing detailed conversations with this other version of me, interactions that included information only I should know. A woman mentioned that I had recommended a specific property listing to her at the farmer's market, describing features of a house I was indeed representing but had never discussed publicly. A restaurant owner said I had stopped in for lunch and chatted about my concerns regarding a difficult escrow situation, referencing details from a confidential client file. These weren't vague encounters. This other version of me was accessing information, engaging in contextually appropriate conversations, functioning as a convincing duplicate of my professional and personal presence in Wickenburg. Then I saw myself. I was walking down Frontier Street toward my car when I glimpsed someone crossing the intersection half a block ahead. Same height, same build, same hair color and style, wearing a jacket identical to one I owned. The figure moved with my gait, carried themselves with my posture. I called out and started walking faster, trying to close the distance, but they turned a corner, and by the time I reached that intersection, the street was empty. No stores they could have entered, no parked cars pulling away, just an empty sidewalk where someone who looked exactly like me had been standing seconds before. I stood there, questioning what I'd seen, wondering if stress and the accumulating strange reports had created a visual hallucination, but the experience felt absolutely real. Security footage should have provided clarity, but instead deepened the mystery. A client mentioned seeing me at the bank, so I contacted the bank manager I'd developed a professional relationship with and asked to review their security footage from that time period. She agreed, and we watched the recording together. The footage clearly showed someone who looked like me entering the bank, conducting business at a teller window, exiting the building. The physical resemblance was perfect. Movement patterns identical to my own, even wearing clothing I recognized from my wardrobe. But I hadn't been at that bank on that day. I'd been showing properties in a completely different part of town with multiple witnesses. The bank manager was visibly disturbed by the discrepancy, especially when I showed her my location data and receipts proving I'd been elsewhere during the timestamp on her security footage. The most terrifying incident happened at the bed and breakfast where I was staying. I'd spent the evening working in my room, organizing property files, and preparing for next day showings. I went to sleep around 11, alone in my room with the door locked. When I woke around 3 in the morning, items in my room had been rearranged, not dramatically, but noticeably. My laptop moved from the desk to the dresser. Files restacked in a different order, my jacket hanging in a different section of the closet than where I'd left it. Small changes that someone familiar with the room's layout would notice immediately. I checked the door lock. It was still engaged from the inside. The window was latched. Nobody should have been able to enter the room while I was sleeping. I immediately went to the front desk and requested to review security footage from the hallway outside my room. The night clerk was initially reluctant but agreed when I explained the situation. We watched footage from the previous 6 hours. At 2:47 in the morning, the camera captured someone approaching my room door, someone who looked exactly like me wearing pajamas identical to what I'd gone to sleep wearing. This figure used a key card to open the door and enter the room, remaining inside for approximately 8 minutes before exiting and walking back down the hallway toward the stairs. But I'd been asleep inside that room during that entire time period. The security footage showed me entering my own room while I was already inside sleeping. I packed my belongings that night and checked out immediately, moving to a hotel in Surprise rather than remain in Wickenburg. I continued managing my property listings remotely as much as possible, making brief trips into town only when absolutely necessary and never staying overnight. The sightings of my double continued for about 3 more weeks, then abruptly stopped. Clients and residents who'd regularly reported seeing me in various locations stopped mentioning these encounters. The phenomenon ended as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving no explanation for what had occurred. I eventually closed all my Wickenburg listings and refused subsequent opportunities to work in that town, recommending colleagues take any assignments there instead. The experience left me with profound questions about identity and presence that I still can't answer. Was someone deliberately impersonating me with extraordinary accuracy, accessing my personal information and security to create a perfect duplicate? If so, why? What would be the purpose of such an elaborate hoax? And how would they manage the physical resemblance so precisely that security footage couldn't distinguish us? The impersonation theory required conspiracy and resources that seemed implausible for what appeared to be a purposeless deception. The alternative explanations were somehow more disturbing. Doppelganger phenomena exist in folklore across cultures, stories of people encountering exact duplicates of themselves, often interpreted as omens or supernatural manifestations. I'd always dismiss such stories as superstition or misidentification, but I couldn't dismiss security footage showing me entering my own hotel room while I was inside it. I couldn't explain away dozens of detailed reports from credible witnesses describing interactions with someone who looked and acted exactly like me, but wasn't me. The evidence was too consistent, too well documented to attribute to mass hallucination or coincidence. I've become obsessively careful about documenting my location and activities since leaving Wickenburg. I take frequent time-stamped photographs, maintain detailed calendars, keep receipts for everything, create digital trails that can verify where I am and what I'm doing. Friends and family find this behavior excessive, symptomatic of anxiety disorder triggered by the Wickenburg incidents. Maybe they're right, but the experience taught me that identity is more fragile than I'd understood, that the boundary between self and other can become permeable in ways that violate everything we assume about individual uniqueness. If someone or something can replicate me so perfectly that witnesses, security cameras, and even my own perception can't reliably distinguish us, what does that mean for the concept of individual identity itself? I've researched similar cases, looking for precedent or explanation. Doppelganger reports exist throughout history, but most are brief encounters or single sightings. The extended, multiple witness, video-documented phenomenon I experienced in Wickenburg doesn't match typical patterns. I've found no satisfying explanation in psychological literature, paranormal research, or rational investigation. What I'm left with is irreducible mystery, the certainty that something impossible occurred, documented by security footage and corroborated by dozens of independent witnesses, yet completely outside any framework I can use to understand it. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the double after the sighting stopped. Did it simply cease to exist? Did it move to another location and begin duplicating someone else? Is there some alternate version of me still walking around somewhere, living a parallel life with my face and mannerisms? The questions spiral without resolution, and I've learned to accept that some experiences can't be explained or understood, only endured and remembered. I avoid Wickenburg entirely now, even driving routes that bypass the town rather than risk passing through. The rational part of my mind insists that the phenomenon was temporary, localized, unlikely to recur, but I can't shake the deeper fear that whatever created that double might still be present, might manifest again, might decide that one version of me isn't sufficient. Real estate is fundamentally about location, about understanding places and their unique characteristics. Wickenburg taught me that some places have characteristics beyond property values and zoning regulations, characteristics that can manifest in ways that defy conventional understanding. I carry that knowledge with me now, approaching every new town with awareness that beneath ordinary surfaces might lurk extraordinary strangeness. Most communities are exactly what they appear to be, but some, like Wickenburg that January, reveal themselves as something more complicated, something that can take your identity and duplicate it for purposes you'll never understand. I'm grateful the phenomenon ended when it did, before whatever was creating my double decided to make it permanent. Has technology ever shown you proof of something you know didn't happen? My name is James, and up until June 2024, I worked seasonal positions as a wildfire lookout for the U.S. Forest Service in eastern Arizona's Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. The job involves spending 2-week rotations alone in remote fire lookout towers, monitoring thousands of acres of wilderness for smoke or signs of fire during high-danger periods. It's isolated work that attracts people comfortable with solitude, people who can handle weeks without human contact beyond brief radio check-ins with ranger stations. I'd worked 5 seasons in various lookout positions across the Southwest and considered myself well-suited to the psychological demands of isolation. The tower near Springerville, where I was stationed in June 2024, taught me that isolation creates vulnerability, that being alone and visible in remote wilderness can make you a target for threats you never anticipated, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are human beings who've abandoned society's rules entirely. The Springerville Tower sits at roughly 8,500 feet elevation, surrounded by ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forest that stretches for miles in every direction. The tower itself is a standard Forest Service design, a small cabin mounted on a steel framework that elevates it roughly 100 feet above the surrounding terrain, providing 360-degree visibility across the landscape. Access is via an external steel staircase and catwalks that wrap around the cabin perimeter. Inside, the space is maybe 12 by 12 feet, equipped with basic necessities, including a bed, small cooking area, communication equipment, and the fire-finding instruments used to triangulate smoke locations. It's Spartan but functional, designed for solitary occupancy during fire season, when lightning strikes and human carelessness create constant ignition risks. I began my rotation on June 1st, hiking in with 2 weeks' worth of supplies and settling into the familiar routine. Daily weather observations at specific times, continuous scanning of the visible landscape with binoculars, monitoring radio frequencies for updates from the Ranger District, maintaining equipment, preparing meals, reading during downtime. The work requires alertness, but isn't physically demanding, mostly involving patient observation and the ability to distinguish between normal atmospheric conditions and the subtle indicators that suggest fire. The first 3 days were completely routine, beautiful early summer weather with afternoon thunderstorms building over the mountains, spectacular lightning displays at night, no fire starts within my observation area. On the 4th day, I noticed people moving through the forest below the tower. This wasn't particularly unusual. The area sees occasional hikers and hunters despite its remoteness. What caught my attention was their behavior and appearance. Through binoculars, I counted at least 8 individuals, all wearing tactical-style clothing and carrying what appeared to be rifles. They moved deliberately through the forest in a coordinated pattern that suggested military or law enforcement training, communicating with hand signals, maintaining specific intervals between individuals. They were clearly conducting some kind of operation, but I couldn't determine what. Public land allows various uses, including hunting, but something about their demeanor felt wrong, felt purposeful in ways that suggested they weren't recreational users. Over the next several hours, I observed them establishing what appeared to be a perimeter around the base of my tower. They positioned themselves at intervals surrounding the tower's foundation, remaining mostly concealed in the tree line but visible enough through binoculars that I could track their positions. I attempted radio contact with the ranger station to report the unusual activity, but my radio produced only static. All frequencies were blocked with white noise, suggesting deliberate jamming rather than equipment failure or atmospheric interference. That's when real concern began setting in. Someone had intentionally disabled my communication capability while surrounding my position with armed individuals. This was coordinated, purposeful action directed specifically at isolating me. I secured the cabin door from inside and continued observing through windows. Around midday, several of the individuals approached closer to the tower's base, and one called up using a bullhorn, demanding I come down. His voice carried clearly, amplified above the wind and forest sounds. He claimed they were conducting citizen oversight of federal operations, that fire lookouts represented illegal government surveillance of free citizens, that I needed to descend immediately and submit to their authority. The rhetoric matched sovereign citizen ideology, the anti-government extremist movement that rejects federal authority and sometimes targets federal employees with harassment or violence. I'd heard warnings about these groups during seasonal training, but never expected to encounter them in such a remote location. I refused to respond or descend, hoping they'd eventually lose interest and leave. Instead, their demands escalated. They shouted threats, accusations about federal tyranny, and surveillance overreach, insisting I was violating their constitutional rights by occupying a tower that allowed observation of public land. Their logic was paranoid and incoherent, but their presence was absolutely real and increasingly threatening. Several attempted to climb the tower stairs, forcing me to barricade the access hatch with equipment. The cabin was designed to be secure against weather and wildlife, not against human attackers, but the single entry point provided some defensive advantage. The siege continued through the afternoon and into evening. They made multiple attempts to force entry, pounding on the hatch, trying to pry open windows, shouting continuous threats about what they'd do when they got inside. I inventoried everything in the cabin that could potentially serve as a weapon. Firefighting tools included a Pulaski, essentially an axe-hoe combination tool, and a shovel, both heavy and capable of being used defensively. I positioned these near the hatch, preparing for the possibility of physical confrontation if they breached the cabin. The psychological pressure was extraordinary. Trapped in a small space 100 feet above ground, with hostile armed individuals below determined to reach me. No communication with outside help, no timeline for when this might end. As darkness fell, they started a fire at the base of the tower. Not a wildfire spreading through the forest, but a controlled burn using debris they'd gathered, creating smoke and heat in an apparent attempt to force me out. The tower structure is steel and wouldn't burn, but the smoke created serious problems, reducing visibility and creating respiratory irritation. I sealed the cabin as much as possible, stuffing gaps around the hatch and windows with clothing to minimize smoke infiltration. The temperature inside increased uncomfortably as the fire below radiated heat upward through the steel structure, but I maintained position, refusing to descend into their custody. Around midnight, they escalated to gunfire. Shots were fired into the tower structure, rounds impacting the steel framework with sharp metallic clangs that rang through the darkness. They weren't shooting directly at the cabin yet, but the message was clear. They had weapons and were willing to use them. I positioned myself against the interior wall farthest from the entry hatch, behind the limited cover provided by equipment and furniture, trying to present as small a target as possible if they did begin firing at the cabin itself. The reality of potentially dying alone in this tower, killed by extremists who decided I represented some imagined federal tyranny, became viscerally real. I managed to disassemble the radio enough to bypass whatever jamming frequency they were using and broadcast a distress signal on emergency channels. It was a desperate measure, manually tuning through frequencies until I found one that wasn't completely blocked, then transmitting repeatedly, "Tower location, armed hostile individuals, request immediate law enforcement response." I had no way to know if anyone received the transmission, but it was the only action available beyond waiting for them to either breach the cabin or lose patience and leave. The breakthrough came around 3 a.m. when I heard helicopter rotors approaching. Law enforcement helicopter, searchlights sweeping the forest, response to my distress signal. The individuals below scattered immediately, abandoning their positions and disappearing into the darkness. The helicopter circled my tower location, spotlight illuminating the area, then landed in a nearby clearing. Officers approached and secured the area while I descended from the cabin, emerging from the siege, shaking and exhausted but physically unharmed. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing information. The group had been under surveillance by federal authorities for months as part of a sovereign citizen network operating across Arizona and New Mexico. They'd been targeting federal employees, particularly those in isolated positions, as part of an escalating campaign of intimidation. I was apparently one of several lookout operators they'd identified as potential targets. My location's remoteness made it ideal for their purposes. Isolated, difficult to reach, allowing them hours to conduct their operation before law enforcement could respond. If I hadn't managed to get that distress signal out, the siege could have continued indefinitely, possibly escalating to fatal violence. 3 of the individuals were arrested that night. Others escaped into the forest and were apprehended over subsequent days. They faced multiple federal charges, including assault on a federal officer, weapons violations, conspiracy, and domestic terrorism enhancements due to their ideological motivation. The legal proceedings are still ongoing, and I've had to provide extensive testimony about the incident. But the legal resolution doesn't address the psychological aftermath of spending hours trapped in that tower, listening to threats, preparing for violent confrontation, genuinely uncertain whether I'd survive the night. I completed my 2-week rotation after the incident, but requested transfer to ground-based positions for the remainder of the season. I couldn't return to tower duty, couldn't face the isolation knowing how vulnerable that position made me to similar attacks. The Forest Service approved my transfer and implemented new security protocols for lookout operations, including improved communication redundancy, faster response procedures for reported threats, and consideration of deploying lookouts in pairs rather than solo during high-risk periods. But these administrative changes didn't erase my experience or restore my sense of security in remote assignments. I left the Forest Service entirely at the end of that season, taking a position as an emergency dispatcher in Tucson, where I work in a secure facility, surrounded by colleagues and communication systems. The isolation I once found peaceful now triggers anxiety. I can't be alone in remote locations without experiencing hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats, planning escape routes, and defensive responses. Friends suggest therapy for PTSD, and they're probably right, but I've been reluctant to pursue formal treatment, preferring to simply avoid situations that trigger these responses. What haunts me most isn't the physical danger, though that was certainly real. It's the realization that my job, my presence in that tower performing routine fire prevention work, was interpreted by these individuals as justification for violence. I represented federal authority in their paranoid worldview, which made me a legitimate target regardless of my actual function or intent. There was no reasoning with that ideology, no way to explain that fire lookouts exist to protect forest resources and public safety, not to conduct surveillance on citizens. Their reality was so distorted that facts couldn't penetrate, and that distortion nearly got me killed. The incident received some media coverage, though not as much as I expected. Federal employee targeted by extremists, isolated siege in remote tower, dramatic helicopter rescue. It should have been national news, but it barely registered beyond regional coverage. Maybe that's because these incidents are becoming more common. Attacks on federal workers by anti-government extremists normalized to the point where they're no longer particularly newsworthy. That normalization terrifies me almost as much as the incident itself. If targeting isolated federal employees has become routine enough to barely merit coverage, how many other people in positions like mine are at risk from individuals who've convinced themselves that government workers are enemies deserving violence? I still love the forests, still appreciate wilderness and the importance of fire prevention work, but I'll never return to lookout duty, never again put myself in a position where isolation makes me vulnerable to people who've decided ideology justifies violence. The job I once found peaceful and fulfilling became a trap, and I was lucky enough to survive and escape. Others in similar positions may not be so fortunate if these extremist movements continue targeting federal workers in remote locations where response times are measured in hours rather than minutes. The individuals who besieged my tower believed they were defending freedom against tyranny. In reality, they were domestic terrorists willing to harm or kill someone whose only crime was doing a job that benefits everyone who values forest preservation and wildfire prevention. That disconnect between their perceived righteousness and their actual criminal violence is the most disturbing aspect of the entire experience. When people are convinced their cause justifies any action, isolated workers like I was become expendable obstacles rather than human beings deserving of safety and respect. I carry that knowledge now in everything I do. Awareness that ideology can transform ordinary people into dangerous threats, that isolation equals vulnerability, that no job is worth dying for when extremists have decided you represent something they oppose. I survived June 2024, but part of me remains trapped in that tower, listening to threats and gunfire, waiting for help that might never arrive, preparing to defend myself against people who saw my existence as justification for violence. Could you defend yourself if help was hours away? That wraps up our journey through Arizona's most disturbing small-town horror stories. These 9 accounts prove that terror doesn't need big cities to thrive. If these stories kept you up at night, smash that like button and subscribe to Unheard Fears for more true horror from America's forgotten places. Drop a comment, sharing your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe out there.